Hi, it's Maya here, and today I'm giving out recommendations for science fiction and fantasy books written by LGBTQ plus authors with LGBTQ plus characters, mostly main characters except for one instance. Some of them are own voices, some of them are not. I mean, it might be a transgender author writing an intersex character, for example. I'm not going to center on the authors on this video, but instead on the books. I've been thinking about doing a video like this for a while now, and since it happened to be a topic for this week's Booktube SFF Babble, I decided this was a good time to film it. And I will leave a link to the Booktube SFF Awards Goodreads group down below. Let's get on with the recommendations. My first recommendation is The Red Tree by Caitlin R. Kiernan, which is a lesbian main character. I have to give out two warnings about this book. First is that at the beginning of the book, the main character is already dead. This book is written as her diary that is published posthumously, so if you're not into that, skip this book. The second warning is that in her diary, the main character writes about another character that she claims she's bi, so that's a questionable choice of words. So this is a dark fantasy or slow horror book about Sarah Crow, who is a writer who rents out this old house in rural Rhode Island and goes there to try to start writing again. From the house's cellar, she discovers a previous tenant's unfinished manuscript about local legends and ghost stories, some featuring the ancient oak standing on a desolate corner of the house's property. Sarah also has some sort of chronic neurological disorder that causes seizures, which may or may not be epilepsy, and it sometimes causes her to miss time. The book's main strength is the oppressive and suspenseful atmosphere. Nothing much happens, but the tree and the cellar still scared the shit out of me. It doesn't help that Sarah often starts to tell about some weird thing that happened, but then doesn't want to focus on it and starts writing about something completely different, which lets the reader's imagination run wild. I read this last year and I gave it 4.5 stars. My next recommendation is Swordspoint by Ellen Kushner, which I have mentioned a lot in recent videos, but what you gonna do? This is a fancy of manners novel with a bisexual protagonist. In fact, most of the characters in this book are bisexual. Swordspoint tells of the master swordsman Richard St. Vier, who lives in Riverside, the bad part of town, with his boyfriend Alec. Nobles who live on the rich hill on the other side of town hire these swordsmen to settle their disputes, and because of one such duel, Richard gets tangled in the plot of the nobles. What I loved most about this book were the interesting complex characters, especially Alec. Nobody quite knows where Alec came from before he appeared in Riverside. He appears to have no sense of self-preservation. He goes around picking fights for Richard to fight for him since he can't fight himself. He's very vulnerable and self-loathing, but he doesn't cower and he antagonizes people on purpose. He's quick to anger and his moods are quick to change, and I absolutely loved Alec in all of his complexity. I read this in 2015 and gave it 4.5 stars. I took away half a star only because of some point of view skipping in between paragraphs. My next recommendation is the Queers Destroy series from Lightspeed. There are 3 issues: Queers Destroy science fiction, fantasy and horror. The issues have original short stories, reprints and some non-fiction, all from LGBTQ plus creators. From the fantasy issue, I'd especially recommend The Lily and the Horn by Catherine M. Valente. This is a fantasy story which tells in gorgeous prose about the preparations for an irregular poisonous feast. I've only read one story from the horror issue so far, but I highly recommend Hungry Daughters of Starving Mothers by Alyssa Wong. It is a super creepy story with some unusual predators. I haven't yet finished the science fiction issue and I don't have a favorite or a specific recommendation from it yet. Another one that I mentioned quite recently in my videos is Shadow Eyes by Sophie Campbell. This is the only recommendation that I chose not because of the main character, but because of a side character, the main character's best friend Kaisha, who is intersex. This is a superhero science fiction comic about the aspiring vigilante and moody teenager Scout Montana, who transforms into this blue superhuman creature and becomes the vigilante superhero Shadow Eyes. But Scout also discovers that she can't turn back. Apart from the superhero plot, this comic focuses on the interpersonal relationships, the relationship between Scout and her mom, the friendship between Scout and Kaisha, Kaisha's boyfriend Noah, and Shadow Eyes' number 1 fan, Sparkle. I gave the first one 5 stars and the second one 3 stars because the second one focused on the sort of plot that I usually dislike. And then I have a pretty popular recommendation, Every Heart a Doorway by Shannon McGuire, which has an asexual protagonist, as well as a transgender side character. I've read and heard a lot of praise from asexual reviewers for the book's depiction of asexuality, which isn't often represented in fiction. This is a fantasy novella that tells of Nancy, who has just returned from this magical land that she traveled to through a portal, and her parents don't know what to do with the changed Nancy, so they send her to this school called Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children. And it's a school for children who have been similarly thrown out of magical otherworlds. But Nancy hasn't been at school long before tragedy strikes. My favorite thing about the book was the focus on portal fantasy. I'm interested in books that tackle the question of what happens to kids who return or are forced to return from magical otherworlds, especially if, like the Narnia kids, they grew up into adults in the magical world and then are thrown back into their kids' bodies. I absolutely loved the parts focusing on that and could have read a lot more about that. By the way, another good book that tackles that topic is Catherine M. Valenti's The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making, if you're interested. I read this one last year and gave it 4 stars. So those were all of my recommendations. I also want to mention a couple of books that are on my TBR. First is The Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps by Kai Ashante Wilson. This is a fantasy novella with a gay black protagonist, or I might have heard that he might be bisexual, but I haven't read a lot yet, so it hasn't been stated. I'd also like to read Nala Hopkinson's Falling in Love with Hominids, which is a short story collection, and at least some of the stories feature LGBTQ+ characters. And I'd really like to read this before Hopkinson comes to Finland as a guest of honor of Worldcon. And finally, I have Tanya Huff's The Firestone on my Kindle, and this seems to be a high fantasy book with bisexual male protagonists. So those were my recommendations. Please give me your recommendations, especially if you know of science fiction and fantasy books with transgender protagonists, because I know I didn't have any on my list. So I'll talk to you more in the comments. Bye for now, see you in my next video.